Back here on our program as we talk about taxation and the Bahamian economy, and we have Greg Flowers, Gowan Bow, and we have also Edson Sumner and Mr. Philip Galanis. And Mr. Bow, I started with you, and let's continue with you. You know, people are wondering whether or not the numbers that the government placed in this budget, whether they are achievable. They expect to have an increase of $400 million, but given what you were saying about the possibility of having a contraction in the economy, they might very well fall short and considerably short of 400 million, eh?
I think what we have to focus on, we often say that government is not a business. And I always wish to debunk that theory, because government is a business. It may not be a for-profit business, but it has to have a mindset of running itself as an enterprise. It is the largest effective organization in the country. When you talk in excess of $2 billion in revenue being collected and in excess of $2 billion in expenditure being expended, that we have to start looking at it in terms of saying, well, how do I look at my fiscal affairs from the perspective of analyzing what we would call best case scenario, our base case, our worst case. How do we ready ourselves, if you will, to make adjustments in the event that things don't play out in the manner that we expect? We've lived in an environment where I've watched budgets in my professional career now where there has never been a debrief on why did we not achieve the budget of the previous year. And even worse than that, we have experienced where the outturn has always been revised for years to come afterwards. So it means that we effectively don't have a target that stops. It's a continuing moving target. There's no analysis as to why we didn't achieve either the revenue or the expenditure that we had set out. And more importantly, what are the assumptions that go into it? And this isn't just with this recent budget. We have no real understanding in terms of how they develop what revenues they're going to collect, meaning they're looking at what the size of businesses will be. So when you think about business license fees, that's a percentage of revenue. Are they really looking at economic growth and saying, well, our business is going to grow, business is going to contract? Are we going to see new businesses? Are we going to see businesses going out of business? And so therefore we have a framework that says if our trends are not moving in the manner that we wish, we can adapt. One of the areas, I mean, persons have been very critical. And to be honest, if you're not a part of the solution, you're part of the problem. So you can't continually bash. But what you have to look at, and I would expect government to do, is what took place during the recession for a number of financial institutions where they created what they call the bad bank and the good bank. And the bad bank was, if you will, ring fence the problem. Continue to run that off and address it. But the good bank is what you're saying, that all things being equal, this is what's going to be the normal scenario. So what do I mean by in the government? The minister has indicated that a large part of the government's expenditure is going towards legacy bills. Well, in reality, that should be pulled out. It is still a part of the overall budget, but that should be pulled out so that we know how much of the good budget is being used to address the legacy challenges that are there. We should then be looking at saying that the current budget, excluding what we've inherited, if we want to use that term, and to be honest, all governments inherit what they don't know. But when we look at the good side, it is then saying, well, is it actually achieving the objective that I say I want to achieve in 3 years? So if I were to say, remove the 370 million or thereabouts that the government has indicated is necessary in order to clear legacy issues. Are we then in line with the 0.5% of GDP as it relates to fiscal deficit? Are we analyzing our fiscal situation on a basis of saying that I'm not clouding your objectives, or I'm not clouding your performance by a whole number of issues so that I can't hold you accountable for not achieving what you may call your steady state and move into the future? And I think that when you look at businesses, a business will tell you that if I had a defunct product, I know I have to work that off, but I know what it is. If I have a line of business that is no longer performing, I have to shut that down, but I know the cost of restructuring and shutting that down, that is effectively set aside. And government has to be thinking in the same way. It has been done with a local bank in terms of hiving off the bad performing loans. And really the question is that institution better off? Is it performing as you would expect it to do so? But you can analyze, and we won't get into that institution. I'm just saying that there is even a precedent, even within government, for it. And we didn't see that taking place now. We have to mature beyond this position of saying every time there's a change in government, that the incoming government found the cupboards bare, the outgoing government saying you're not following my policies. And in reality, we have to get to a point in time of saying, well, let's be able to judge your policies by virtue of saying, well, if I am able to segregate between good and bad, and you're saying this is what you inherited, then you can clearly articulate that I'm, if you will, robbing Peter to pay Paul, but there should be an end to that.
In this document, the Minister of Finance, he says that his government is doing the right thing. He says, our government fully appreciates the sacrifice that the substantial increases in VAT and other taxes will represent for our citizens. But as I have repeatedly said on record, this government was elected to do what is right for the welfare of the country and not to do what is politically expedient or politically popular. Gentlemen, there are some people in the business community who believe that the business community is already overtaxed. Is it already overtaxed, even before this budget?
Many of us feel that way. When you consider that we're paying business license fees, we're paying real property tax for those who own property, and even those who don't own but are renting or leasing are still having to pay their portion of that property tax. There's some level of corporate taxes as far as company license fees, et cetera, concerned that has to be paid to the registrar on an annual basis. All of us are paying national insurance contributions on behalf of our staff. Some of us, it's not a tax, but it's still a cost of insurance to the employer having to pay for their medical plans and some pension plans, et cetera. So then, of course, those who are importing product having to pay customs duty, importing, et cetera. So there are a whole compendium of taxes that are being imposed on the private sector business community. Many companies in this country today have reported to us and telling us that what they're paying, for example, in their business license fees is more than they're taking home in profits every year, because many of them are operating at a deficit. They're operating at a loss because we have been complaining now since they changed the business license infrastructure, the fee structure, to where they're charging on your gross revenue, right, rather than your profits or net returns. That's become a big burden on businesses. And we've been appealing to the government, not only this current but the previous government, that they need to re-examine that and revisit it. Fortunately now, there is a process that's going on currently where there is a consultancy that's happening with Deloitte, who are examining the issues relative to a corporate tax and looking at the business license fees and the rest of it. We don't expect that to take effect anytime soon, right? That may be another couple of years down the road, perhaps. But it is a very real sentiment. Like the young people say, the struggle is real.
How can you grow your economy or stimulate the economy in this environment?
It is very, very difficult to do so because a lot of businesses, as Mr. Sumner just said, feel as if they're overtaxed. Now, I think that some companies are overtaxed. I think there's an overtaxation of businesses that have difficulty paying the business license fee because of the way it's computed. There are many companies that I work with that have revenue and pay their business license fee, as all companies do, on the basis of revenue, but have no profits. And that is inequitable. There's no other way of putting it. It's inequitable. There are other companies, and I want to speak to some of the banks maybe, principally the banks, because most of the banks, except for Mr. Bose and Bank of the Bahamas, Commonwealth Bank, the large Canadian banks, I don't think are paying their fair share. And it would, to add insult to injury, when it's not paying their fair share, they're paying a bank license fee. And that's essentially all they pay. They don't really pay other taxes commensurate with the kind of performance that they earn. And what's more insulting, and more inequitable is that those profits are expatriated back to Canada. And so many of those companies make a tremendous amount of money here in the Bahamas, and then the beneficiaries of that revenue, of that activity, are the Canadians. Okay, and so I think if you're talking about equity, which is what the minister spoke about being equitable, you need to look at that. The other thing I think that we need to really be careful about and be mindful of is that I believe, and maybe the gentleman could correct me, I believe the Bahamas is the only jurisdiction in the world that has a VAT that doesn't have an income tax. The VAT normally comes after the income tax. We did it the other way around, and for reasons that have been explained, and no problem with that. However, what we've got to take into account, and what the Chamber, I'm sure, fully appreciates, is that with the accession to WTO, supposedly at the end of next year, 2019, we are likely to see a further reduction in customs duties. That revenue has to come from somewhere. That has to be replaced by someone, and has to come from somewhere. Either VAT is going to have to increase, we'll have to have a payroll tax of some sort to help defray that cost, but more likely what we're hearing about more, and what I think is probably more equitable and more, is a progressive income tax, a progressive corporate income tax initially, and that will be rapidly followed by, I think, a progressive personal income tax. But what I'm saying essentially is that even though companies now believe that they're overtaxed, they haven't seen anything yet. We work as accountants in a tax environment. We work with people who pay taxes all the time. We have a third, in most jurisdictions, tax accounting represents a third of the revenue of the accounting firms, because there's so much tax involved. And so we are going to see a tremendous...
You're in accountant's paradise now.
Well, no, not yet. And I don't want to see that happen. I don't, but I mean, I think we are overtaxed. And
but if you were to grow the economy,
yes,
and give incentives to web shops, to other institutions, wouldn't you be able to get the kind of revenue if the economy grows?
Well, Mr. Jones, also, we in the game house operating business have a problem with the decisions, and this is not the first time the government has taken this route with this sliding scale approach in terms of defining who will pay what percentage of their revenue to the government and at what rate. We find that to be unacceptable, to say the least. But with that being said, it has been used before in the past. Under the former administration, when we were negotiating the tax for the industry, I think Mr. Andy Gomez from Grant Thornton were the consultants for the government at the time. And we discussed back and forth ways and means for taxation. But the problem we had at the time was the government was seeking to achieve a certain number in revenue prior to implementing the tax, because there was this huge problem in front of the government to justify regulating the industry. There was this number that they had, and they came up with, I guess Mr. Gomez as a consultant would have gone down, they came up with a scale whereby we had to pay 6 years back tax in order to obtain a license. And I found it very targeted at myself, because at the time I was the only company with digital data going back 6 years. And of course, my company being the leader of the pack at the time, we were told that we were to bear the brunt of the burden in order for this to move forward. Well, I made arguments back and forth, and fruitless to say that it went nowhere. But I was against it then, and I'm against it now, that this system in which the government is implementing, targeting certain entities, knowing quite well what category you will fall in prior to, and then determining the amount in which they will take from each of us is not acceptable to me. I find that very difficult. I paid back then for my license for FML, which was $3.8 million. Okay, now for my license. And here is another operator who just started.
I paid nothing.
Well, no, he paid the $250 plus his fees.
Yes.
So he ended up paying $300,000 approximately, and I paid $3.8 for the same license for both of us to go out and compete in the same industry, which I thought was unfair then, and I'm certain today that Island Luck is feeling the same way. But this policy has been around for some time. But I don't support it, and I certainly will not support this position being taken today. So when we speak of taxes for us, we've always negotiated in good faith to try and pay our fair share of the industry. We've never ever. We've always sat down with the gaming board and with other government officials and come up with a working solution so that both parties can benefit. It is very difficult for us today, extremely difficult, after making the sacrifices that we would have made. We were asked to bring all of our documents, bring in and then sign affidavits and commit ourselves to the government, to be a partner with them, and that there will be no charges against us for any wrongdoing. There will be no force for us to reckon with. We will go down the road as partners in this relationship. That's where we were.
The government is about fiscal responsibility. They talk about fiscal responsibility at every turn, and gives the impression that pressure is being brought to bear on the government of the Bahamas by outside agencies, by international organizations. How realistic is it for the government of the Bahamas to seek to balance the budget in 3 years, or to have a surplus every year for 3 years? How realistic is that?
The challenge they have before them is, unfortunately, we allow outside forces to have a greater influence than I believe they should. And the reason being is because, as Anton de Saint-Exupéry said, a goal without a plan is just a wish. And for our administrations, they have set out that they have these very ambitious goals, but never really articulated a very clear plan. And so our external observers have become saying that it's just a wishful country, that they will always continue to give us grand ideas and grand plans or grand objectives without the appropriate plans. When we speak to these external observers, whether they be rating agencies, IMF, World Bank, they always say that if there is a clearly articulated plan with benchmarks, measurements, and analysis looking back, that they would base their decisions based on that. We are in an embarrassing state where our GDP growth is being projected by outside forces, and we then adopt it in our communications. As opposed to saying that our Department of Statistics is being, if you will, strengthened to the point that these outside agencies rely on their projection of GDP growth. Going back to your earlier comment about growing the economy, it is always easy to say that I simply impose taxation. It is a tremendously challenging notion to grow the economy. But let's look at what growing the economy does. It broadens the pie. And so, whilst businesses and individuals say we are overtaxed, statistically we're not. Because when we look at the size of our GDP, the taxation levels are not anywhere near what they are in the first world countries. We've had revised GDP numbers that even brought that number down, but those revised GDP numbers were not actual growth. Those were what I'm going to call paper growth, because it just meant we were reporting poorly in the past. So if we are really to say progressively move to a system of taxation where it is a higher number, it has to be clearly set out that we have a plan that people can come behind. The National Development Plan is an attempt at that, where it's saying a few things. Let's identify the vision and objectives of the country. Let's identify those areas of deficiency that we need to address. But more importantly, let's identify those areas of strength that we should now be exploiting to take advantage. Governance is one of those areas of deficiency that if we correct, we have a greater chance of achieving all of these objectives, because people will now become accustomed to saying that when I set out a plan, I have actually made a commitment. If I fail to meet that commitment, what happens in the private sector? The CEO says, I'm going to do something and does not achieve it. There is, if you will, immediate repercussion for going down a path and not having, if you will, the appropriate implementation strategy to achieve it. And I think when we look at this one and saying, well, do I achieve fiscal responsibility or fiscal surpluses or balanced budget in 3 years? Well, what was the magic number of 3 years? More importantly, what would be the repercussion if you don't? And in reality, who are the people? Names, not administration. Who are the names I can say that this was the plan you set out? And so therefore, as CEO, CFO, Chief Operating Officer, you are the ones who will be held accountable, as opposed to saying, well, I had a great objective. If I don't meet it, you know, my apologies. And we've too long been in a situation where that's all we've gotten, is really saying, I've done my best. But in reality, I'm not saying that they were not minded to do the best thing, but they haven't executed.
Yeah, Mr. Jones, I believe that the government is really hard-pressed to explain to the Bahamian people what's driving them to a 3-year balanced budget position. They've not adequately done that. And therefore, it leads me to believe that there must be political motivation. I don't believe that they are this is being imposed upon them by the international rating agencies. I don't believe it's being imposed upon them by the IMF. If you look at our basic numbers, our key economic indicators, we are far, far beyond that. We're above the threshold that will require those kind of very stringent impositions by the agencies and institutions, IMF and rating agencies. Therefore leads me to believe that why are you boxing yourself into a 3-year time continuum? Is it because you're motivated to get this to a point where you can look good for the next election? Is it really politically motivated? And is it fair to do this is it fair to put this kind of burden on the Bahamian people out of political motivation? And so the government really has to explain to us why the 3-year magical number.
And it hasn't.
It has not done so. It's taken us, as someone mentioned, I think since independence, nearly 45 years ago, to this point to get to where we are. And we are not in a bad place. We certainly need adjusting. We need adjustments in our fiscal, in a number of fiscal areas. But it took us 45 years to get here. Why do we believe that we can extricate ourselves from this in 3 years? It's unrealistic. It's not going to happen. And I think it does the country a disservice, and it does the citizens of the country a disservice to try to put this kind of burden, this onerous burden on people to try to achieve this objective in such a short period of time. I hope I'm wrong. I want the government to succeed, because if it succeeds, we all succeed. But I think the government is really flawed in terms of prognosticating that they could do this in 3 years. It's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. You agree with that, Mr. Sumner?
I think there'll be a challenge, but bearing in mind this is only a budget. We've got to measure projections against actuals in the next budget cycle to see if they have achieved any of those objectives. So certainly...
Or even at midterm.
Or at midterm. Midterm is just doing a review, but the real numbers will come at the end of the next fiscal period. So we believe that these, of course, it's a projection. We'd love to see the actuals in the next year or so. And who knows, maybe midterm they might have a shift in some of the policies, right, if they're not meeting and keeping pace with the targets they project for themselves.
But given the numbers that we have experienced in the first quarter in tourism, arrivals, it's a good picture, isn't it, Mr. Bowe?
Well, I think this is why a number of the businesses have expressed concern that we are finally turning that proverbial corner in the sense of seeing an uptick that is actually being felt.
Yes.
So we've had growth for the last few years, but mediocre growth, right?
Yeah.
Point something or 1%. Nothing that is substantial enough to say that it moved the pendulum one direction.
But these taxes can put a damper on things.
That's where persons are saying that if you are going to increase taxes, then have a very clear strategy as how you're also going to bolster the economy. We have to use a tax system as a lever to grow the economy. And we've given concessions, and we have a very elaborate concession plan when we look at some of the developments and projects that have taken place in the country. And yes, they have been good for the country, but we have not really done an analysis to say, well, what we forego has been paid back multiple times over. And every time we give a concession, if we say that the government was entitled to $1, and I concede that into a project, then I would expect the economy to grow by 10, so that when I take my 19%, I get $1.90.
Mr. Bo, thank you very much. Mr. Flowers,
been a
thank you so
pleasure,
very
sir.
much. Mr.
pleasure.
Sumner.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Galanis,
Pleasure to be
very
here.
much.
Thank you.
This has been quite an education. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for watching and listening to our program, and good evening, everyone.